That's very low. Hello everybody, and welcome to Lawrie Goes Loco. Now, the observant amongst you might think that this doesn't look much like a railway. And in some regards, you're right. This bit here is definitely not a railway. This is a recreation of a First World War trench. And honestly, it's pretty grim in there. My boots are all muddy and everything now. So why am I here? Well, today we're at the Apedale Railway, and this is part of their First World War recreation, because we're going to be looking at a locomotive that was fundamental in bringing supplies to the front line during the First World War. So this thing is one of the most iconic vehicles that worked on the rails of the First World War, and it is a Motor Rail Simplex. And these things are pretty common. In fact, most narrow gauge railways in this country will have one of these in some form or another. But this one is particularly interesting, not just because the fact it is of the right period. This one was constructed somewhere during the First World War. We're not entirely sure when. We know that it came back after the war for rebuilding, but we don't actually know when it was built, which is interesting. But what's particularly important about this and the whole design is how it changed everything in this country, narrow gauge wise, after the war. You see, when the war started, we had to get supplies to the front. And that was pretty easy over here because all the big railway companies in the UK, they all worked together, goods got loaded up, got shipped down to the port, shipped over to France. That's fine. The trains in France run on the same gauge. Also fine. The problem is, when you get to a front, your big railways don't work very well. And there wasn't really any way to get goods off your big train to your troops who needed it. So lots of things were tried. Now, lorries, and they get stuck. Horse and cart doesn't work particularly well. So it got to 1916 before a chap called Sir Lawrie Geffers was asked to find a better way of getting goods to the front. And so he performed an investigation, a study, seeing the best ways that it had been done and the best ways it could be done. And he found that in some places, the French had started using found narrow gauge railways to move stuff. And this is where the idea came from, that this was going to be the way to move things to the front. 2-foot gauge is light, you can move it around, but you can have a substantial enough locomotive to move things around. A loco like this would be able to pull something like one wagon containing ammunition for one large gun, which isn't a lot when you think about how much was going to be transported, because at its peak, things like this were transporting 165,000 tonnes of goods around the British front lines in a single week. Bearing in mind, again, this will move about one wagon, gives you an idea of the scale of things like this moving around, which is bonkers. And frankly, the war effort couldn't have continued without the railway network being put down and things like this working it. So for winning the war, this is actually a vitally important piece of equipment. And obviously, this was a big step forward from steam engines because they kind of give away where they are with plumes of smoke. Whereas this thing is a little bit more stealthy. And obviously a lot of you guys will be aware of there is a bigger version of this, which is commonly known as the Tin Turtle, with the extra armour and bigger everything. And we'll probably look at that in another video, but today we're looking at the more basic, simple version. This. So how did this end up revolutionising the UK industrial railway system? Well, after the war was over, there were quite a few of things like this left over. In fact, the army had ordered something like 800 steam engines, 800 similar to this things, almost 500 Baldwins came from America, 100 Alcos, and 200 kind of petrol, electric, basically hybrid vehicles made by Dick Kerr and Westinghouse, which is a phenomenally large amount of locomotives. And then there were almost 11,000 wagons manufactured for the war effort. So what do you then do with all this stuff? It's not needed anymore. Well, the answer is quite simple. You take it back, you do it up, and you sell it to industry. So suddenly, 2-foot gauge became the new standard. Because it had been, previous to that, 3-foot gauge was a far more common gauge. So this was a very clever bit of marketing and reusing old equipment. So this one here, despite what this number says, because this is its army identifier, or it could be, it's a army identifier of sorts. Whether or not that one actually applies to this loco, we don't know. It's there for effect. This one is number 2197, built in sometime during the war and rebuilt sometime after the war. These exact details have been lost to us. This one is known as a 20 horsepower tractor because originally it had a 20 horsepower 2-cylinder petrol built by Dorman. Now, it got changed when it got rebuilt to make it a bit more better and a bit more powerful, being replaced by something completely different. It's a 2-cylinder diesel Dorman engine producing 30 horsepower. So that's a mighty increase, in fact, almost like a quarter more powerful. So this has now become an almost untamed beast with its sheer horsepower. Of course, I'm making that up. It has made not that much difference in the grand scheme of things because it weighs about 2.5 tons. So an extra 10 horsepower doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Following this thing getting rebuilt, it got sold off. And that was somewhere in the period, somewhere between 1921 and 1922. And it went to McAlpines, which is quite interesting because it is, of course, from Sir William McAlpine, the descendant of Sir Robert McAlpine, where I bought my own locomotive. So this one's got kind of a link to me and my engine, which I think is really cool. I'm kind of doing the McAlpine fleet at the moment. And it was then used on the construction of the Welsh Highland Railway, which is a really quite a major thing for this to have taken part in, because most of you being railway people will know of the Welsh Highland Railway and the fact that it's in recent history been recreated and relayed and now basically runs across Wales as a whole. So this thing did it first time round, which is fantastic. In fact, I know a good story of Sir William McAlpine. Apparently when the railway was going to be rebuilt, he went and inspected it with some of the members of the board who were planning to put it back. And one of them made a comment to him about, "Look at that bridge, it's falling down. That's shoddy McAlpine work." To which Sir William turned around and said, "Well, when you finish paying for it, we'll do a proper job for it." Because it was well known that the McAlpines took on quite a large share of the original railway in lieu of actually not being paid because the railway didn't have the money. And I always thought that was quite good. Some point after the contract had been completed, somewhere around the 30s, we think, there's a lot of we think with the history of this engine, it was sold off and went to the Menworth Sewage Works, and it spent its time working there on the complex at that site. Following its life in industrial service, it was sold and ended up at the KB Light Railway, which was the home of the famous Teddy Boston, who was a good friend with a very famous railway author who made a couple of stories about a certain blue tank engine. And he stayed there running around his Rectory Railway, which was well known within railway circles as being quite the fun place to visit. Following the railway's closure in 2005, this moved again, coming here to Apedale in the April of 2006. And since then, this has been its home. It lives here now. And frankly, they haven't had to do that much to it. It's had a new coat of paint, and that's basically it. It's had its regular servicing, but more or less as it arrived. Since then, it's done a couple of other things. It's had a couple of visits away to other railways, and most notably, in 2014, it took part in the War and Peace exhibition at Folkestone. So that was kind of quite a cool thing for it to be, again, doing something and celebrating its links to the First World War. One of these little things gives you a mighty top speed of around 10 miles an hour. Now, 10 is quite terrifying in my own standard gauge Ruston, so on one of these things, it must be truly, truly terrifying, like a whole new level of terror of this bouncing around on quite low to the ground on a track that's not perfect. But apart from that, this thing is actually in remarkably good condition. It's really well cared for. I mean, the paint and everything, it shows a locomotive that's been well cared for and looked after, which is pretty much true for everything in the Moseley Railways Trust. One of the only things I've noticed so far that actually needs any attention on this is the fan belt's missing. But that doesn't really matter because, first of all, it's a diesel, we're not doing very much, and it is a frightfully cold day here in Apedale. So we have kind of like atmospheric cooling going on. The drive comes off this engine via a sprocket and 2 gears, which drives both axles, which means all 4 wheels are driven. And that means that it will pull somewhere around, well, one of the D wagons, which will weigh something like 12 to 15 tons. Now, that might not sound like an awful lot, especially not on the level. And then you consider the kind of track that we'd have to be working on. And frankly, being able to pull anything on conditions like that is nothing less than miraculous. I mean, how these things didn't just, well, they did come off a lot, but it's heavy and it's low to the ground, that's why it doesn't just fall off all the time, but it must have been something else operating in conditions like that. One of the most distinguishing features about these locomotives is the radiator, mounted sideways on rather than at the front as you would in your traditional vehicle. Very much the calling card of the Simplex. And if we look into there, you can see the quite substantial flywheel that keeps everything ticking over, which in a bit I'm going to have to turn over by hand. And then we have the nice little touches here, like the Simplex logo and Motor Rail stamped onto the sanders here, which have no sand in them. And then the nice rebuild plate on the front, which has got rebuilt stamped into it. It was a builder's plate and then rebuilt stamped onto it, which doesn't actually tell me when still, it just tells me the loco's number. Finding the locomotive's cab is not really the right word. We're going to go with control deck or flight deck. It's now a flight deck, that's a much better way of calling it. First of all, we have this luxury chair which is shaped nicely to accommodate your back size with absolutely no cushioning whatsoever, because only the very best luxury on a thing like this. It also has a nice little tool space under here that has paint. Useful if you need to make on-the-run repairs. Just put a bit of paint on the loco. No paintbrush, just paint. Here we have the handbrake, which is your primary source of stopping the locomotive, and in fact probably your only way of stopping the locomotive apart from going uphill. This is a clutch. So we've got clutch pedal here, which is pushed in the that way direction. A sander for rear and front here, which again you stand on. Direction is controlled by this little lever here, which moves back on its own. Stay. Good lever. And then over here, this is the gears, which is slow and slightly less slow, followed by a tiny little throttle there, which is a spring-loaded affair, so if you let go, it slows itself down. That is it. There are no gauges. There are no other brakes. The only way you know it's got too hot is when steam starts to erupt from the top of the radiator. It is basically as simple as you can go, which is why it's awesome. So all that remains really now is to do my favourite thing, which is a hand start, and let's fire it up. Thankfully, we're back onto Lawrie's remarkably easy engines to prep. First of all, we slide this panel across here, which reveals the fuel tank. We take the lid off, and now we have a peer in and see if there's any fuel. But there is a patented technique for checking the fuel level, which is we pull out the coupling pin. As you see, I've done this before. Dip the coupling pin in, and it has this handy stopping technique. And if it comes out wet, it means there is fuel in it, and we can run. So that's brilliant. We'll put that back on, like that. Shut that, and put the coupling pin back in there. We next come round to the radiator and pop the cap off, and as long as we can see water in that, everything's fine. So which means next thing to do is go over and check the engine. Now this thing has got this quite remarkable and clever system. If we open it up, there's a little catch up here. It's got a stand. Isn't that clever? Remarkably clever. And just in here, down there, we've got the dipstick. Now I would wipe this, but we already know it's full of oil and it's very oily. But technically you should wipe it, but we know it's there. The group has prepped this for me. And I've dribbled oil all over the nice frame. And that's basically everything. The only other thing we have to do now is prep the throttle. And as I said earlier, the throttle, as you can see, with a little counterweight, the throttle with this little counterweight resets itself. So we get our coupling pin / fuel dipstick, and we just hang that over the throttle to keep it wide open. We then set the decompressors to open or off, whatever you want to call it, or not to compress. We get a starting handle like this, and we put it into the locomotive, and then we call for some assistance to come throw the handle over. So we get our starting handle, put it in, wait for it to locate, and then start turning it over. Go! Oh. Thank you. All you know is happiness about being able to start an engine. That started really easy as well. That was delightful. With that all done, all that remains is to take it for a run. And what's pretty special is we're about to travel along some First World War track. Actual genuine First World War track on a First World War locomotive. So this is genuinely actually quite special. The only thing to do is to lower myself down into this quite low seat, which is quite comfortable when you're there. Then clutch in, find a gear which is possibly somewhere there, choose direction, find a gear which is that, handbrake off, and away we go. The track, it moves! So what's interesting about this coupling arrangement is this universal system. So we've got our pin through here and a link that drops into there. So I need to pull forward. Oh, that hurt. I need to pull forward for that to drop in there like that. Now, most things like this, most 2-foot gauge coupling systems are normally have the pin that drops through like this. This is a slightly different being like this, and it's a more universal system, so it can couple to different types of coupling. So all we need to do now is stick a pin through there. So, what's this like to drive? Clutch in, select a direction, release clutch, put it into gear, like a car because we're on a hill, find that biting point, and away we go. So handbrake's off, and I'm now just giving it a little bit of throttle. Unlike a lot of the Rusters that I've driven, this is something you really do drive on the throttle rather than on the clutch. And already I can feel the weight of that wagon behind me as we come up this curve. So there is next to no suspension or cushioning in this seat at all. I can feel every bump in the track, and actually I can feel every rev of the engine, every chug I can feel coming through. But that noise, it's very slow to respond. You push the throttle wide open and it takes a while for it to actually do anything. But the noise is glorious. And very quickly, it becomes what feels very fast. Now, I envision we are only doing 3-4 miles an hour, but 3-4 miles an hour feels very fast. Especially on the condition of driving a locomotive designed for the First World War on track laid in the style of a First World War railway going to the trenches. It's quite terrifying. I am told that it's very unlikely that it's going to come off the line. I'm still terrified that it's going to, because of the way the track's laid, and you can kind of see the track snaking and dipping and bouncing, which is, yeah, a little alarming, to be honest. Now, this thing does give an immense sense of power. Now, on the kind of grassy track, we just get one of these wagons loaded up, and that's all it would really be happy to pull. So obviously there is a complete and utter lack of a cab, which means it's really quite cold. I've got my jacket on and a polo neck jumper, and I'm still quite nippy. I could really do with a pair of gloves for operating this engine. And it really makes you think of the sensation of what it must have been like to operate one of these on the front, because it would have been catastrophically cold. So, but driving this around on the front with a constant fear of, well, death and explosion above your head, not to mention the fact they were driving these at night. I can at least prepare for the track. I can slow down, I can see it's still there, but driving this around in the night with no lights on, not sure if the track's still there. Jeez, it must have been something else. Freezing, can't see, feeling your way along the railway. I mean, this gives me some sensation of what it would have been like, but I can't even begin to imagine what the people who fought and worked on these must have experienced in the First World War. Beyond words. Honoured to be able to do this. First World War locomotive on a traditional railway is just fantastic. But I mean, already I can feel my backside starting to get a little bit numb. It's not a comfortable seat. The seating position itself is quite comfortable, but every single knock and bang on this loco, you feel it. You really do. It's not something I'd want to work on day in, day out, because it would be getting very uncomfortable. And the only thing about not having a cab that's particularly good is, you know that if you had a cab, the noise in here would be almost unbearable, whereas sitting out in the open, at least there's nothing for the sound to reverberate around on. Now, obviously, not having a cab, visibility is superb everywhere. I can see everywhere, there's nothing in the way. I'm not quite sure what's happening just in front of the engine, because I've got the bonnet here in front of me that stops me seeing just what's there, but compared to anything else I've driven, it's got perfect visibility, which is kind of obvious really with the lack of the cab. Driving it, it's really quite easy. It's just this throttle is really nice down by my side. So we're going to try changing gear. So throttle up, shift, down the clutch, into second. That was not a good gear change. That was abysmal. But that second gear, and crunch the gears. But now it's gonna. That was quite an unpleasant gear change, that was. Now, second gear is definitely terrifying for this track. But it is just a throw it over and hope kind of jobby, and it's quite unpleasant. It definitely feels, It's also quite a weird sensation having a clutch on a locomotive. It's far more akin, as you guys can probably appreciate, to driving a car. You're like, oh yeah, what should we do? Slowing down, and clutch in to disengage. It's quite strange. And then your control of pulling it away is so much on your control of your clutch. Of course, another thing to take away from this is just what a happy little engine it sounds. Little two-cylinder thing. It sounds naturally very chuggy, but it sounds so healthy. It's a really happy little unit there. Listen there. Honestly, it's one of the best things about this is just the noise it makes. It's very, very satisfying. Now, one of the things I suppose we should do now is just find out how well the brakes work. So, high section line, clutch in, and handbrake on. You know what? That's pretty effective. That comes on nice. I mean, you have to wind a lot, but yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Now, of course, the big question is, would I have one of these on my fantasy 2-foot gauge railway? Of course. As I said, I think pretty much every 2-foot gauge railway has got one of these in one form or another. They are an exceptionally common locomotive, and let's be honest, with over 800 things like this being built for the war effort, it's no surprise there's loads of them kicking around in preservation. And it is just such a traditional 2-foot gauge engine. It's, when you think 2-foot internal combustion, sitting sideways on this with an exposure radiator, this is very stereotypical. And it does really suit this section here of the field railway here at the Apedale Railway. So, this brings us to the end of this video, looking at this quite remarkable little First World War locomotive. And I have had an absolutely fantastic time being able to drive around on what's called the Field Railway here at the Apedale Railway. And the Field Railway is basically what you see me on today. It's the recreation of a trenches First World War railway. The actual railway, where you take for passenger use, is actually much nicer than this. It's actually laid properly and it's quite nice. This is very much a demonstration railway, not for passenger use, because it's laid as it should be for a First World War railway. But as a driving experience, as you can see from earlier, I loved it. So yeah, massive thank you to the Apedale Railway for inviting us up here and letting us have a look around. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've had an amazing day out, and it's just been lovely just recreating the whole feel of one of these things, and kind of on a cold and grey day like this to actually kind of get a sense of what it might have been like, obviously without the danger and everything, to operate one of these railways. Now, me and Ben, my cameraman, we have been here at the railway all day. We have not even seen a fraction of the collection of everything in the Moseley Railway Trust. It is an absolutely magnificently massive collection of narrow gauge locomotives here, and if you're in the area, I cannot recommend this place enough. It is fantastic. All the volunteers are super friendly. We've been made to feel right at home, and really guys, you should come and visit. It's magnificent, and have a look around. If you want to find out more, there's a link in the video description, and it should come up on screen now, to their website. And if you really like what you've seen and you feel like I'd like to get involved in this, then there's a link to the email for getting in contact and having a conversation about helping out. And well, if you want to try and learn how to drive one of these or some of the other magnificent machines here, it's well worth a look. So a massive thank you to the Apedale Railway and the Moseley Railway Trust for allowing us to come along today and letting us drive this and sample a First World War railway. So a massive thank you to you as well, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for being part of this. We are totally blown away by the amount of support we've had recently, and we'll be coming back to the Apedale Railway in the future to drive some more of the locomotives they've got here. And if you've got a locomotive or you're part of the society and you'd like LMM to come and visit, please get in contact, because we'd be very much up for that, and we really enjoy doing this kind of thing. And if you've enjoyed this video, well then please like, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment, get involved. And if you haven't already, get involved with our Discord. And if you enjoyed this video of the narrow gauge, guys, how about clicking up there for another narrow gauge adventure? Or if you want something on the standard gauge, how about clicking down here for standard gauge action? See you later, guys.